Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. And also let me know where y'all are watching from and at what time. I'm curious. It started with a couple of hikers. They came into the ranger station looking rattled, not lost, not injured, just off. The man, mid-30s, kept rubbing his arms like he was cold, even though it was a warm September afternoon. The woman, maybe a little younger, had this dazed look in her eyes, like she wasn't fully here. "You ever been out to that part of the trail?" the man asked. "Near the old fire road?" "Plenty of times," I said. "Why?" He hesitated, then looked to his wife for reassurance. "There's something wrong with it," she said, her voice hushed. "It's too quiet." I raised an eyebrow. "Too quiet?" "You don't understand," the man said, leaning in. "There's no sound, no wind, no birds, no crickets. Just nothing. And then, when we walked through it—" He stopped, swallowed. "I don't remember getting back to the car," his wife finished for him. "One minute we were standing in that dead part of the woods. Next thing I knew it was dark and we were on the main road." I made a note in my logbook. Unnerving, sure, but plenty of people got spooked in the deep woods. There's something about untouched wilderness that reminds folks how small they really are. Still, the details were odd enough that I decided to check it out myself. It was about a mile in when I noticed it. One second I was hiking a normal stretch of Yosemite forest, birds calling, leaves rustling in the late summer breeze. Then, like stepping through a doorway, I was inside it. The silent section, everything just stopped. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even my own footsteps felt wrong, like they were being swallowed by the earth before the sound could fully form. I stopped walking and held my breath. The silence was absolute. I clicked my radio. "Ranger Rick to base, you copy?" Nothing, not even static. I turned the volume dial up and down, tested different channels. The red light flickered, but there was no sound. My skin prickled. I don't spook easy, but this was different. I'd been in remote parts of the park before, dense areas where the canopy muffled noise, places where the stillness felt ancient. But this wasn't natural. This felt intentional. I checked my watch. 2:13 p.m. I figured I'd take a quick walk through, then head back to write up a report. That was the last normal moment I'd have for a long, long time. I kept walking. The deeper I went, the more the silence pressed in, like I was moving through something thick and heavy. Even my breathing felt strange, too loud in my own ears, like I was underwater. I glanced back the way I came. The path was still there, but something about it felt wrong, off-kilter, like the trees had shifted just enough to make me doubt myself. I pushed forward, forcing myself to focus. This was still my park, my territory, just a weird patch of dead air, nothing supernatural about it. At least that's what I told myself. I reached a small clearing and checked my watch. 2:35 p.m. I'd been here just over 20 minutes. That's when I heard it. A faint crackling sound. Not from the trees or the underbrush, but from my chest, my radio. The static was weak at first, barely a whisper. Then it surged, filling the dead air with a harsh, garbled hiss. "Base, this is Ranger Rick. Can you hear me?" No response, just more static. I twisted the volume knob, but it made no difference. And then, just as suddenly as it started, silence. I sighed and shook my head. Probably just interference. Still, a gnawing unease curled in my stomach. Something about this place wasn't right. I took out my trail cam and secured it to a tree. If anything strange was happening here, I wanted proof. The motion sensor would catch any movement, and I could review the footage later. Satisfied, I turned to head back. And froze. The sun had moved, not just a little. It was low in the sky, hovering near the tree line. The light had shifted to that deep golden hue of late afternoon. I checked my watch. 7:41 p.m. 5 hours had passed. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. No way. No way. I swallowed, trying to stay calm. Maybe my watch had broken. Maybe I just thought I'd only been here a little while. Maybe. My stomach growled. A sharp, empty ache, the kind you get when you've skipped more than one meal. I checked my pockets. My granola bar wrapper was empty, but I didn't remember eating it. A cold sweat broke out along my back. I didn't run, not yet. But I moved fast, retraced my steps, made it back to my truck, and peeled out of there as fast as the dirt road would let me. Back at the station, I yanked the memory card from my trail cam, shoved it into my laptop, and clicked through the footage. At first, there was nothing. Just still frames of trees, unmoving. The timestamps lined up with the missing hours, no gaps, no skips, just nothing. Then I clicked on the last image. My stomach dropped. The camera lens was cracked. The timestamp was missing. And through the distortion of the fractured glass, I swore I could see a figure standing just behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk, staring at the distorted image on my laptop screen, the cracked lens warping the edges of the figure behind me. The shape was vague, tall, shadowed, but there was something wrong about it. The proportions weren't right. My rational brain told me it was a trick of the light, a glitch from the damage to the camera. But another part of me, the part that had felt that unnatural silence pressing down on me in the woods, knew better. I needed answers. The next morning I went back. The silent section looked the same, but it felt different, heavier. I found my trail cam still strapped to the tree. The cracked lens gleamed in the morning light. I left it there. I moved deeper into the woods. That was my first mistake. The trees were covered in carvings. At first I thought they were just old graffiti, maybe some bored hikers or teenagers screwing around. But the more I looked, the less that explanation made sense. The symbols weren't random. They followed a pattern, twisting and curling in shapes that made my skin crawl. Some looked like eyes, dozens of them gouged into the bark, staring in every direction. Others were stranger, impossibly intricate spirals and jagged runes that seemed to shift if I looked at them too long. The carvings got fresher as I moved deeper. The edges of the cuts were sharp, raw, like they'd been made recently. Then I saw the one that made my blood run cold. My name, Rick. It was carved into the trunk of a massive oak, deep enough that the wood was still pale beneath the bark, and the cut was fresh. I staggered back, my pulse hammering. I had never been this deep into the silent section before. No one should know I was here, and yet someone or something had carved my name. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I forced myself to breathe. Think, Rick. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe another ranger had been here recently and... A low creak echoed through the trees like the sound of wood bending under pressure. I froze. The sound came from behind me. I turned, heart pounding. Nothing, just trees, just silence. And then, ever so slowly, one of the carved eyes in the bark started to bleed. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was sure I was out of the silent section. The moment I broke through the tree line, it was like stepping back into the real world. The sound of birdsong, the rustling of leaves, even my own ragged breathing. It all came rushing back like I'd been underwater and just surfaced. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying to steady myself. My mouth was dry, my limbs shaky. I had spent too much time in there, but I had to go back, because if someone was out there carving my name into trees, I needed to know who or what they were. I returned the next day, this time with a plan, bright orange tape. Every 50 feet, I tied a strip of it to a tree branch. Even if my compass went haywire, even if my sense of direction got scrambled, the tape would give me something solid to follow back, or at least that's what I thought. About an hour in, I noticed something was wrong. I should have been following a straight path, marking every few trees as I went. But when I turned around, the first piece of tape was gone. I frowned. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. I kept walking, tying new markers as I went. 5 minutes later, I glanced back again. Gone. A cold, creeping dread settled in my stomach. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. The trees stood still, their carved symbols watching me. I tried retracing my steps, heading back the way I came. But after 5 minutes, I found myself somewhere completely new, a part of the woods I had never seen before. Panic nipped at the edges of my mind. I needed to think, focus. I took out my compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to settle on a direction. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't possible. I picked a direction at random and walked. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The sun moved overhead, shifting into late afternoon. The air grew thick, the silence pressing closer. And then I stepped into a clearing. My breath hitched. At the center of it stood an old stone circle, massive weathered boulders arranged in a perfect ring. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The stones were smooth, too smooth, like they had been worn down by centuries of footsteps. I had never seen this before. And yet, as I stood there staring at it, I had the sinking, horrible feeling that it had been waiting for me. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the stone circle. The air felt thicker here, charged with something I couldn't name. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to take a step forward. Then another. The stones loomed over me, ancient and impossibly smooth. Each one was taller than I was, arranged in a precise formation that felt deliberate. I ran my fingers over the nearest boulder. It was cool to the touch, too smooth for erosion alone. The way the surface curved felt unnatural. I didn't want to be here. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. "Rick!" My own voice calling from deeper in the woods. I went rigid. No, I had been alone this entire time. I turned slowly, heart hammering, scanning the trees beyond the clearing. "Rick, over here!" It was close now, just beyond the tree line, my own voice mimicked perfectly. I didn't answer. Something about the way it spoke, too flat, too exact, sent a deep primal terror through me. Then from right behind me, turn around. A whisper, not my voice. Someone or something was right next to my ear. I clenched my jaw, fighting every instinct in my body. Do not turn around. My skin prickled, every hair on my arm standing on end. I could feel it. A presence behind me, watching, waiting. Do not turn around. I sucked in a shaky breath. Slowly, without making a sound, I stepped backward out of the stone circle. Another step, then another. The presence behind me didn't move. I reached the tree line, muscles wound so tight I thought they'd snap. And then the silence broke. Wind rushed through the trees, leaves rustling. A distant bird call rang through the air. The spell, whatever it was, had lifted. I finally turned, and saw nothing but the empty clearing. No one had been there, but the stone circle was still waiting, and the air inside it was still dead silent. I ran. Back at the station, I locked the door behind me and sat at my desk, hands still shaking. The rational part of my brain tried to process what had happened. Maybe I was dehydrated, maybe I had gotten turned around, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I had heard my own voice calling from the trees. I had felt something standing right behind me, and I had done the only thing that mattered. I hadn't turned around. I needed answers. I spent the rest of the night combing through old ranger reports. Yosemite's been around a long time, and rangers keep records of everything. Missing hikers, animal attacks, strange sightings. Most of it is routine, but every so often you find something that doesn't fit. I started searching for anything related to the silent section. It didn't take long. The first report I found was from 1913. A section of the Western Trail remains uncharted due to the absence of wildlife and disorienting effects on those who enter. Rangers have reported losing time, feeling watched, and returning with no memory of how they left. Some have claimed to hear voices calling their names, but no one has been found. I swallowed hard and kept reading. The report stretched across decades. 1952. Ranger Jameson failed to return from patrol. His gear was found stacked neatly at the tree line. His boots were missing, replaced with a bundle of twigs wrapped in vine. His journal was recovered, but the last page contained only symbols etched deep into the paper. 1979. 2 rangers entered the silent section for an overnight survey. One returned at sunrise, sickly and disoriented, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. The other was never found. The survivor was transferred out of state. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He was later committed to a psychiatric facility where he was described as muttering about doors in the woods and watchers in the trees. He died within the year. I felt sick. This had been happening for over a century, and yet no one talked about it. Rangers avoided that section of the park. Let it be. But now, for some reason, it wasn't letting me go. I was being watched. I knew it. I could feel it. Even here in the station, surrounded by walls and light. Somewhere out there, just beyond the tree line, they were watching. and I had the awful feeling that this was only the beginning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stone circle, the carvings, the thing behind me. I woke up before sunrise, every muscle aching with exhaustion, but I knew I couldn't ignore this. The silent section wasn't just some strange, forgotten part of the park. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me, and I had the sinking feeling that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. By noon, I was back at the clearing. The silence swallowed me the moment I stepped inside. I moved cautiously, scanning the area, my gut twisting with dread. Nothing had changed. The stone circle was still there, still wrong, its smooth surfaces untouched by time. Then I saw it, lying in the center of the stones, a mask, wooden, carved with delicate precision. The grain of the wood followed the curves of the design, giving it an almost organic feel, like it had grown rather than been made. The eye holes were large, empty, dark. I had never seen it before, but I knew it was for me. I bent down, hesitating, then picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the wood, the world shifted. I wasn't in the clearing anymore. The forest was different. The light dimmer, the trees taller, their trunks twisting into unnatural shapes. The sky above me was a deep bruised purple, and the air hummed with an almost electric charge. I wasn't alone. They stood among the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Tall figures, elongated limbs, faces obscured behind masks of wood and bone. They watched me with an unsettling stillness, their forms just a little too blurred, a little too unreal. And above them, perched high in the branches, was something else, something vast. Its hollow eyes were locked onto me, waiting. A voice, not spoken but felt, slipped into my mind. "Wear it." I swallowed hard. "Join us, guardian." The voice was wrong, not demanding, not hostile. It was offering. A way out, a way in. The mask felt warm in my hands, like it was pulsing with something alive. I could feel the weight of their stares, the weight of the choice. The voice whispered one last time, "Leave the silence behind." I dropped the mask. The world snapped back. I was on my knees in the clearing, the mask lying in the dirt in front of me. The trees around me seemed taller, closer, watching. I ran. And behind me, in the silence, I swore I heard something laughing. I made it back to my cabin just before dark, heart hammering like I'd run a marathon. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and stood there, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The mask, the offer, the things in the trees. I had done the right thing, leaving it behind, I knew that. But I also knew something else. This wasn't over. I moved to the window and peered outside. The forest stood dark and still, stretching beyond the reach of my porch light. And then something moved, at the tree line, just at the edge of the light. I felt my skin crawl. It wasn't just one figure. There were several, tall, motionless, watching. I backed away from the window, heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the front door, stepping onto the porch. The second the light hit the trees, they were gone. Just empty forest. I swallowed hard. It had been real. I knew it had. I turned back inside, bolting the door behind me. But as I did, I noticed something on my porch. A small bundle of leaves, tied neatly with twine, a gift or a warning. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mask, the figures, the hollow-eyed thing watching from the trees. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't restful. My dreams were filled with twisting symbols, endless forests, and a whispering voice that wasn't quite a voice at all. By the time morning came, I felt worse than before. I stepped outside, half expecting to see another gift waiting for me. Instead, my boots were missing, not stolen, not misplaced, just gone. In their place was another bundle, this one larger, wrapped in woven branches and dried grass. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. I knew what it meant. They had been inside while I slept. The silence had followed me home. I didn't go back to the silent section after that night. Didn't need to. It had come to me. The knowledge of that sat like a stone in my gut. No matter where I went in the park, I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back, the silence creeping in at the edges of my world just for a moment before sound returned. I needed answers. I went to the only person who might have them. Retired Ranger Ed Calloway lived about 20 miles from the park, in a cabin older than sin, buried deep in the hills. He was a legend in the service, patrolling Yosemite long before I was born. He was also the only man I knew who had worked that section of the park and lived to talk about it, if he was willing to talk. I knocked on his door. When he opened it, he just looked at me. Then he sighed. "You've been out there," he said. Not a question. I nodded. He let me in without another word. Ed didn't waste time. "You don't talk about them," he said, pouring a heavy splash of whiskey into a glass. "You don't acknowledge them, and if they call your name." He fixed me with a look. "You never, ever answer." I gripped my drink, throat dry. "What are they?" He let out a slow breath. "Something older than this place, older than people. They were here before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone." I swallowed hard. "There was another ranger," he said after a long pause. "Name was Harold Grady, good man. Thought he could figure it out, thought he could stop it." He swirled his drink, staring into the amber liquid like it held answers. He started hearing them, the voices, seeing the symbols. Then one day he started drawing them, carving them into his walls, into his own skin. A shiver ran down my spine. "What happened to him?" I asked. Ed took a long, slow sip of his drink. "One night he walked into the silent section," he said. "Never came back out." A long silence stretched between us. "A couple of months later we found his cabin," he continued. "Nothing left inside but the carvings, and his boots." He looked at me then. "The exact same way I bet you lost yours." My stomach dropped. I stood abruptly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to get out of there. Ed didn't stop me. He just leaned back in his chair and said one last thing. "They remember you now, Rick." I left without looking back. I barely made it home before dark. When I stepped onto my porch, my breath caught in my throat. The carvings were waiting for me, gouged deep into my front door. A message. "We remember you, Rick. The offer stands." And lying on the ground in front of it, the mask. I didn't touch the mask. I didn't dare. It lay at my feet like something dead, its carved wooden face staring up at me with empty, hollow eyes. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. The carvings on my door were deep, gouged into the wood like claw marks. "We remember you, Rick. The offer stands." I forced myself to take a step back. My first thought was to burn it, toss the mask into the fire, sand the carvings off my door, pretend this never happened. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. They weren't giving up. The silence had marked me. I picked up the mask with the edge of my boot, flipped it over. The wood was smooth, almost polished, but as I looked closer, I realized something that made my blood turn cold. The grain of the wood. It formed the shape of an eye, watching, waiting. A cold wind rattled the trees, but the air around me remained still, silent. They were here. I took the mask inside, placed it on the table, and sat down, staring at it. My gut twisted with unease, but I forced myself to think. I had seen what happened to people who answered the call. Rangers who disappeared. Others who came back changed, sick, whispering about doors in the woods and watchers in the trees. I wouldn't be one of them. The next morning I drove out to the silent section one last time. I didn't enter. Didn't cross the invisible boundary where the silence swallowed sound. I just stood at the edge and placed the mask at the base of a tree. A return, a refusal. Then I turned around and walked away. The wind picked up behind me, rustling the leaves, a sound so simple, so normal, yet it made me shiver. Because for a brief moment I swore I heard something beneath it. A whisper, not mine this time, something else, laughing. I stayed on as a ranger, kept patrolling my trails, kept doing my job, but things weren't the same after that. Every so often I'd catch glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line, tall shapes, standing too still. Sometimes in the early hours of dawn, the forest would fall too quiet. Just for a moment, a reminder. I never went back into the silent section. I never spoke of it again. And I never ever answered when I heard my name called from the woods, because I knew what waited if I did. The offer still stood, and they were patient.